No constitutionalist or conservative should have voted for Donald Trump. I'm going to be proving this, but first I want to get into three different observations. The first observation is that this is a values resolution. It's a question of ethics, of what a group of people ought to be doing based on their principles. My second observation is burden of proof. Because we're dealing with ethics, both debaters have to make a moral case for their side. In other words, if I have to make a case against Trump to win, the con must make cases for Trump. My third observation is definitions. Definitions are very important when you're dealing with politics and ethics. Oxford English Dictionary defines conservative as favoring free enterprise, private ownership, and socially conservative ideas. Constitutionalism is defined as the idea that government can and should be legally limited in its powers, and that its authority or legitimacy depends on observing these limitations. This definition is from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So what do conservatives and constitutionalists both have in common? Well, I propose that they have the value of fidelity in common, and this should be our metric for this round. Oxford English Dictionary defines fidelity as faithfulness to a person, cause, or belief demonstrated by continuing loyalty and support. I propose that if Donald Trump is not faithful in either his private or political life, he does not deserve the constitutional conservative vote. And I will be proving his lack of fidelity in two main points, and I'll be expanding upon those two main points in later speeches. My first contention or main point is that Trump lacks social fidelity. Trump has no fidelity to the basic commitments in his life, and for this reason, he is absolutely unqualified for the conservative vote. This is evidence from his extramarital affairs that he's unapologetic about, but also his shady business commitments. And we'll be looking into evidence for those multiple pieces of evidence in later speeches. The second contention is that Donald Trump lacks political fidelity. And we're going to be looking at multiple instances of how Trump has said one thing and then done another. But in the meantime, if you're going to be making a deal with the devil, at least make sure that it's a devil you can trust with your country. Remember the importance of fidelity as the metric. Thank you, and I now pass the mic.
Well, thank you very much. I would certainly agree that Donald Trump was an unorthodox candidate in this election. You're absolutely right. Did hinder a lot around culture and ethics. And that's where politics gets murky most of the time. Donald Trump by no means was my first choice for President of the United States or the GOP candidate. However, we're dealing with a political system in which social justice and identity politics has really become the forefront of speech and debate and policy, like it or not. We tried civility and we tried the typical grassroots social conservative tactic in 2012 with Mitt Romney, and it did not go in our favor. Romney lost the election hugely in 2012, and so I feel like a lot of conservatives threw up their hands and said, okay, well, if we can't win on any of the straight arrow GOP candidates, let's go for a more unorthodox path. Trump, although he may be unorthodox, did bring a energy to the political arena, which I had not seen in my lifetime, at least. He brought up the idea of populist nationalism and making America great again and really re-energizing the entrepreneurial spirit. He wasn't afraid to go after his opponents, although some of his tactics for doing so might not have been what I ultimately would have chosen. I think all in all, though, what I would say for the reason why conservatives should have voted for Trump and why they were right to vote for Trump, and what I'll be focusing on is who our opponent was, and that's Hillary Clinton, one of the most left-wing and honestly corrupt politicians in our history. So this election was about choosing between the lesser of two evils, and Trump certainly was the lesser of two evils, in my opinion.
So I have a quick cross-examination question for you. If you vote for the lesser of two evils, have you voted for an evil?
I would say no. In this case, I think that Trump, although he wasn't, as I said, my preferred candidate, I don't think he was evil. I think he might be inexperienced, but I think in terms of what his vision was for America, he wanted to really focus on rebuilding America's economy, which we've seen happen, not directly just through him, but through the revitalization of private industry. We've stayed out of foreign conflicts. One of Hillary Clinton's big deals with her was she wanted to go into Syria, and that could have started a massive war. What Trump's big strong suit again was appealing to the base that really wanted America to stay within our own country and onto our own ideas.
Okay, thank you. So, really quick, I want to address my opponent's arguments, and then I want to expand upon my own contentions as promised. My opponent has not provided a value, and that's problematic because this is a values resolution. There has to be a unifying idea that justifies voting for Donald Trump, and he hasn't really given a clear idea. If there was any idea that I could parse out from his case, it's probably the idea of frustration. So let's just say, for the sake of argumentation, just so we can move this along, that frustration is what motivated. It's the motivating value here. I think that it's fairly obvious that frustration is not a good value upon which to base your decision making, and fidelity is an operative value. It helps define right and wrong when it comes to our behavior. So fidelity is clearly superior, and for that reason, resolution is something we should vote for. Now, my opponent also had an interesting philosophy towards what he called the lesser of two evils. He said Donald Trump was the lesser of two evils and then backtracked and said Donald Trump wasn't evil at all. This is contradictory, but that's beside the point. There is always another choice. It doesn't matter if Hillary is untrustworthy. That doesn't justify voting for an evil. And also, Hillary Clinton wasn't the only other option. I voted for the Constitution Party candidate. I am a conservative. I chose to take the other options. So this is something my opponent has failed to address. Now, with our remaining time, I want to expand upon the fact that Donald Trump is not trustworthy. You can't trust the man as far as you can throw him. So let's look at that in his personal life. So as I mentioned, he is unapologetic entirely about his extramarital affairs. He said that his affair with Marlo Maples was, and I quote, just a bowl of cherries. And that's not even getting into all the accusations of sexual assault. He's equally shady in his business commitments. He spent at least $68,000 in Cuba and in the 2000s, and then when he was running for the Reform Party candidacy, he lied to Cuban Americans and said he wasn't spending any money. He's not trustworthy. And in addition, there's at least 60 lawsuits pending, including from his former lawyers that he hasn't paid. He doesn't pay people for doing services. So every indication of Donald Trump at the time of voting is that he's an absolutely shady individual. And if you can't trust someone to conform to basic social conservatism, if you can't trust them to keep their promises, how can you trust them with the Constitution? Honestly, I'm going to sum it up this way. If you can't trust that man alone in a room with your wife, are you going to really trust him alone in a room with your country? I don't think so.
My opponent brings up a fair point about Trump's extramarital affairs and moral values. I don't think anyone is saying that Trump is the perfect example of a moral figure. He's not. He has flaws. We all do. I would also say, however, that there have been other presidential candidates, namely Herman Cain, who have also had extramarital affairs. They didn't necessarily conform to that brand of social conservatism, and it hurt them in the end with the GOP. I think with Trump, putting aside all his personal problems with extramarital affairs and whatnot, you have to do that with politics sometimes. And regarding his business dealings, there was a lot of shade regarding his personal dealings. But again, I would ask my opponent what his personal business dealings have to do with running the country, because it's one thing to be running a private forum or educational institution like Trump University was. It's another thing to be deciding policy and deciding foreign affairs. Granted, Trump doesn't have all of the skills necessary by himself to make those decisions, but he's brought in smart people around him to make those decisions on his behalf, and he's so far been pretty good at bringing in smart people around him.
Okay, so I want to address one of the biggest issues with the Cotton case. My opponent said in his speech that Donald Trump isn't perfect. Herman Cain had affairs. So what's the big deal? First of all, it's not the fact that Donald Trump had an affair. It's the fact that he is flagrantly unapologetic about it. He doesn't care about the institution of marriage. And so here's what his shady business dealings, here's what his shady personal relationships have to do with running a country. It has everything to do with running a country. We venerate people like George Washington for saying that he couldn't tell a lie. We venerate Abraham Lincoln. We call him Honest Abe because integrity, fidelity, principles, that's how you know a man is ready to be president. If a man cannot even be faithful to the woman he loves, the woman who bore him his children, why should he trust his country? Why should he trust him to run the country? Donald Trump has repeatedly demonstrated in his business dealings, in his marriages, in his affairs, he only cares about one person, himself. So if Donald Trump only cares about himself, and we've had every indication of that before the debate, why did we vote for him? Well, because he'd help us out politically. How do you know he's going to help you out politically? If you're sitting there at the ballot booth in 2016, how can you trust this man that he's going to come and save you from liberalism? You don't know that he is, because frankly, he can't be trusted. Now, again, it doesn't matter how bad Hillary was. You shouldn't vote for Hillary or Trump if you're a conservative or a constitutionalist. I voted for the Constitution Party candidate because I refuse to choose either evil, either the big evil or the little evil. There is always another option. This is a logical fallacy known commonly as a false dichotomy, and you can't build a case on a false dichotomy. Now, really quickly, I want to get into some more evidence that I had from my original case, and that is how Donald Trump has no political fidelity whatsoever. Pulitzer Prize-winning publication PolitiFact tracked Trump's first 100 days in office and found that he failed to stay faithful to a dozen key positions and promises. These included whether or not NATO is obsolete, attacking Syria without congressional approval, which, FYI, is a constitutional issue, so if you're a constitutional conservative, that really matters, and finally, on making cuts to Medicaid. The impact is that Trump can't be trusted to be steadfast in his political positions. He cannot be trusted to contain the size of government. I know we want to make a pragmatic case for Trump. I know we want to say we're frustrated, but nothing justifies voting for a heinous man. He's not what our country deserves, and he can't be trusted. Not with women, not in business, and certainly not with our country. He is not like George Washington. He is not like Abraham Lincoln. He does not deserve to sit where they sat and to walk.
My opponent unloaded a lot there, and I want to address a couple of the issues and the points that she made. First off, regarding the third party and voting for neither candidate. That idea sounds terrific on paper, but as such, with the way it is set up, it ultimately comes down to two parties. We've seen this over and over again throughout U.S. history. A third party candidate enters the race and they only get 1% of the vote. So third party candidates are effectively hindering the election process and taking away votes from either candidates. If you talk to a Republican, they'll say that a third party candidate is taking away their vote. If you're talking to a Democrat, they'll say the same thing, that the third party is splitting the vote in favor of the Republican, and so on and so forth. Now, regarding what my opponent said about Trump not following through on his first 100 days worth of promises, we've seen that throughout history that no president gets everything that they've promised on the first 100 days in either case. And I would be remiss if I didn't think that we ought to give at least Donald Trump the first year, at least, to set his policy forth. Regarding Syria, yes, you're absolutely right. He did forego authorization to do that drone strike, and as a constitutionalist, that didn't sit well with me, but we did have to send a clear message, and politicians on both sides of the aisle were pretty straightforward about that.
Okay, so I want to respond to my opponent's arguments, especially in the round as a whole, by grouping his arguments and kind of showing what ideas have emerged in the round so far. The first thing I want to address is pragmatism. He said that voting your conscience sounds great on paper, but it's just not viable. He accused third parties of taking votes away from the Democrats and Republicans, to which I say, who gave Democrats and Republicans ownership over the political process? You could just as easily say that the Republicans and the Democrats are taking votes away from the Libertarians and the Green Party. It's a completely arbitrary assessment from the perspective of someone who thinks that the Republicans or the Democrats own the political system. If we just voted for enough, if just enough people voted for Libertarians or the Green Party, then they could win. It's simply mathematics. But here's what's more important. It doesn't matter alone what the results are of an election. You don't just vote to win. Your vote is supposed to mean something. As conservatives, we're supposed to have principles. What is it worth voting for a Republican to win if you compromise what you're supposed to stand for in the process? If we lose ourselves, we've lost everything. Now, my opponent also said that no one ever accomplishes what he wants to in the first 100 days of office, and I just wanted to clarify that for a second. My point wasn't that Trump had failed to live up to his promises, but it was actually a comparison of direct contradictions, direct lies that he's made, and that compromises his fidelity. For example, before becoming president on June 2016, he said, save Medicaid, save Medicare, save Medicaid and Social Security without cuts. And then since becoming president on March 3rd, 2017, he pushed Republican health care plan that would reduce federal spending on Medicaid by $880 billion over 2 years. So clearly the man can't be trusted to stick to his guns about anything. And Republicans, conservatives and constitutionalists, we're supposed to be the people who think that trust matters, trust with power, trust with moral principles. The second point that I want to make is excuses. Why are we making excuses for Donald Trump? Because we're frustrated? Whatever happened to the grand old party? What happened to staunch conservatives who had principles? Who are we? If we're just going to vote for someone because we're frustrated, we're not conservatives anymore. And that leads into my final point. This is an identity crisis. We, as Republicans, were once conservative, right? But suddenly, we look in the mirror and we're no different from the Democrats. Trump is no different from Hillary. You say that she's corrupt, but so is Trump. He's personally, business-wise, and politically degenerate. He's not the person the Republican Party deserves. He's not the person that conservatives deserve, and he's not even the person the alt-right deserves. This man can't be trusted, and no one should vote for someone they can't trust. He doesn't deserve to be president.
Well, you're certainly right that he's not the president that the alt-right deserves, and that's a good thing. But that's a point for another time. I would say in response to the fact that we're a party of principles, you're absolutely right. We are a party of principles, and while Trump again is not the perfect candidate, like or not, the Democrats have had a stronghold on popular culture and media for the last 40 years. What Trump did was he brought the vision of the new right, making America great again, fighting against cultural Marxism and American pride back into the mainstream. Now, that's on the culture front, and that's all fine and dandy. But on the policymaking side, we finally have a seat at the table. And what conservatives, including myself, are hoping with Trump and with the conservative Congress is that now that we have a seat at the table, that we can actually start making policy within all three branches of the government. We couldn't have had that if Trump or any third-party candidate did not win the election, because most likely if Trump hadn't won, we would be stuck with Hillary, and it would be much harder for us to pass policy within Congress and get anything done. So again, this goes back to my point. Is Trump perfect? Absolutely not, but he gives us a seat at the table. And I would also like to mention one other thing. Back in the 1980s, Reagan was a Democrat himself, and I'm hearing a lot of the arguments today from never Trump conservatives, if I could refer to that group. They were the same people who were saying in the 80s that Reagan was not conservative enough and that he wasn't experienced in policy because he was an actor and had only served as a governor.
Okay, so again, I want to bring issues to the fore. I want to group arguments and show where this debate round is going. And the first issue that's really coming up at this point in the round is the issue of principle. Donald Trump has said that he's going to make America great again. And this was one of the points that my opponent used in an attempt to justify a vote for Trump. But let me ask a question. Is electing a degenerate who is unapologetic about having affairs on his wife, who cheats people out of their hard-earned money, who lies to Cuban Americans about having money in Cuba, is a man who breaks promise after promise after promise. Is that America being great again? Is this, honestly, if this, what right here is America being great again, that I guess America was never great to begin with, because this isn't great. This is horrifying. This is a complete disrespect to the legacy of all the presidents who were faithful to their wives, men who could be trusted with their business dealings, and men who showed dignity in this office. Principle is what is at stake here. We can't vote for the lesser of two evils because we voted for an evil. If conservatives don't care about their principles anymore, we're not conservatives. We are pretenders, pragmatists, and we care about nothing but power. And I don't believe that's what conservatism is about. Anyone who's truly a conservative will put principle over power every single time. Now, the second issue that's coming to the fore here is an identity crisis. And I want to reference some classic literature here. It's called Picture of Dorian Gray. In this picture, a man wishes for eternal youth and beauty. And he has this portrait that's painted of him. And in the beginning, it looks just as beautiful as he does. But over time, It begins to reflect how ugly he is on the inside. This is an allegory for the Republican Party. We started out believing in something. We started out being conservative and constitutional. But eventually, we devolved into this debauched, power crazed institution. And now we've elected a man who is a complete degenerate, a man who nobody deserves, a man who can't be trusted as far as he can be thrown. This is a man who was accused of marital rape by his first wife and sexual assault by dozens of other women. This is not America being great again. We have turned into something hideous and ugly. And the only way that we can truly redeem our souls and the souls of America, to say that conservatism and the Constitution means something, is to reject this man. No one should vote for a man that they can't trust. No one should vote for Donald Trump.
Well, you brought up some very good points, not that I agree with all of them, but I've noticed that my opponent keeps bringing up the fact that Donald Trump had several extramarital affairs on his wife. And while I don't condone that behavior from him personally, I would have to ask, at the end of the day, what does that have to do with policy and politics? Let me elaborate on that a little bit. Say that I were to divorce, I'm not married, I'm single, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that I were to be married and for whatever reason the divorce didn't work out. Whether or not I cheated on her or she cheated on me, irreconcilable differences, doesn't matter. Does me breaking the institution of marriage, or her for that matter, if she wanted to run for political office multiple times, does that alone justify me being disqualified in your viewpoint from seeking political office, even if I have the best intentions? This is a trap where the GOP gets caught in a lot, is we seek moral purity, but we live in an imperfect world. You talk about the picture of Dorian Gray, a book which I have also read, and you're right. There is a portrait, so to speak, where the GOP started out as a pure party, but over time we've evolved and, in your opinion, have turned into something hideous and ugly. I don't see it necessarily as ugly. I think we've expanded the party tent by bringing in newer voices. And who's to say that Trump is the culmination of all of this? I think in terms of purity, we would have to go back 40, 50 years. This isn't all on Trump's heel. So I find it a bit ridiculous that we're blaming the entire GOP's quote-unquote decay on Trump.
So to sum up all my arguments, I want to bring it back to the theory, the framing. This is a values resolution. Having a value, a central unifying idea, matters. I have shown how fidelity is a core tenet of conservatism and constitutionalism. I've also demonstrated that if you don't have your principles, you don't have anything. We can see that Donald Trump has no faithfulness to people, to principles, to anything. There is only one thing that Donald Trump cares about, and that is himself. And that is not the tradition of conservatism. It is not the tradition of constitutionalism. And we who voted for him should be ashamed. God save us all.
My opponent has once again, she keeps going back to the moral proponent that Trump wasn't the most moral president. Again, we're not looking for a pure president. We're looking for someone who can be pragmatic and skillful with today's current problems. Was Trump the ideal choice? Absolutely not. But we're still within our first year, so we need to see what happens at the end of this year, and we still have 3 more years.